The Save America Act is another piece of legislation sitting at the center of a political storm this week. The bill includes federal voter identification requirements for elections, protections aimed at keeping biological males from competing in women's sports, and provisions that would restrict gender transition procedures for minors. Supporters of the bill argue that each of these provisions polls extremely well with the American public, with some surveys showing support levels between 80 and 90%. Senator Banks expressed confidence that Republicans would ultimately secure the votes needed to pass it, predicting that 51 of the 53 Republican senators would support the measure. However, there are serious concerns about whether that math actually holds up. Reports have identified at least 4 Republican senators, Lisa Murkowski, Tom Tillis, Mitch McConnell, and John Curtis, as potential holdouts who may not be willing to vote for the bill in its current form. That creates a razor-thin margin, and even 1 or 2 defections could sink the entire effort. The suggestion was raised that separating the voter ID component into a standalone clean bill might give it a better chance of passing by removing the more controversial amendments that are causing hesitation among some members. Supporters of that approach argue it would be better to secure a partial victory on voter ID than to lose everything by insisting on a comprehensive package that cannot reach the threshold needed. The political theater surrounding this bill also drew pointed criticism. The concern raised was direct and worth taking seriously. When you look at both the Department of Homeland Security funding debate and the Save America Act, a pattern emerges. Instead of finding the most straightforward path to passage, each piece of legislation gets loaded with additional provisions that may be popular with the base, but make it harder to get the votes needed to actually become law. The result is that neither bill passes, but both sides get to point fingers at the other for the failure. For ordinary Americans sitting at home watching their airports grind to a halt, watching their tax dollars flow toward conflicts overseas, and wondering why their elected representatives cannot seem to get basic legislation across the finish line. This cycle of strategic failure is deeply frustrating. The broader picture here is one of enormous complexity and high stakes across every dimension. On the international front, the United States is leading a coalition of 22 nations in a direct confrontation with Iran over nuclear capabilities, ballistic missile programs, and control of one of the world's most important shipping lanes. Missile strikes are hitting Israeli neighborhoods. A nuclear research facility has nearly been hit. The Secretary General of NATO is calling the Iranian threat existential. And President Trump is using language that leaves no doubt about his willingness to escalate dramatically if his demands are not met. At the same time, back in Washington, the government is struggling to fund its own Homeland Security apparatus. Airport lines are backing up. Federal agents are working without pay. Congress is deadlocked, and the political parties are using every crisis as ammunition for the next election rather than working together to solve the problems that are actually hurting Americans right now. The money being requested for military operations, for munitions replenishment, for rebuilding defense stockpiles, these are not abstract numbers on a budget sheet. Every dollar represents a choice about what kind of country America wants to be and what role it wants to play in the world. When the senator says that the $200 billion will flow back into American manufacturing and American jobs and American security, that is a substantive argument that deserves to be taken seriously. But it is also an argument that needs to be made transparently and debated honestly, not used as a political cover for avoiding the harder questions about what this conflict ultimately costs and what it ultimately achieves. Iran has been a source of regional instability and a sponsor of armed groups throughout the Middle East for decades. That is not a point of serious dispute among foreign policy analysts across the political spectrum. The question of how to address that reality, whether through military pressure, diplomatic engagement, economic sanctions, or some combination of all three, has never had a clean answer. And the choices being made right now will have consequences that stretch far beyond the immediate military situation. Israel has endured wave after wave of attacks. Its people are living under the constant threat of incoming missiles. Its air defenses are being tested to their limits, by sophisticated weapons designed specifically to defeat interception systems. The human cost is real, and it is growing. The families in the south of Israel, who had their homes and neighborhoods struck by 1,000-pound warheads, did not choose to be in the middle of a geopolitical confrontation. They are ordinary people caught in the crossfire of decisions made by governments and militaries far larger than themselves. The 22-nation coalition now coming together represents something significant. When countries from Europe, the Pacific, and the Gulf region align around a common security objective, it reflects a level of international consensus that goes beyond American unilateral action. Japan and South Korea are not Middle Eastern powers. Australia and New Zealand have no direct territorial interest in the Strait of Hormuz. The UAE and Bahrain exist within the region and have their own complicated relationships with Iran. Yet all of them have chosen to align with this effort, which tells you something important about how broadly the Iranian threat is being perceived and how seriously the international community is taking the need for a response. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. The ultimatum over the Strait of Hormuz is on the table. Military planners from 22 countries are working out the details of a potential operation. Iran continues to fire missiles, and the President of the United States has made his position as clear as any American president has made a position in a very long time. We will find out very shortly whether this confrontation continues to escalate, whether a diplomatic off-ramp emerges, or whether the world moves into a new and more dangerous chapter in the long and painful history of conflict in the Middle East. This is Pulse America News. I'm Kundi. Stay with us because this story is moving fast and we are not going anywhere.